Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. I want to personally thank Sean for inviting me down here to participate in this, and also thank Jamie and IDPC for bringing the entirety of the focal points for the West African region to be a part of this and use this as a platform to be able to interact. Now, I'm going to be presenting on some of the snapshots of what the West African Commission on Drugs has done. Incidentally, I'm not quite sure that I may have been the best person to give this presentation. I say that because a very distinguished commissioner of the West African Commission on Drugs is here in the person of Adiolu, and I think that possibly he would have been able to do so. But I think he has given his nod that I could make this presentation. So I say thank you, Adiolu, for giving me the opportunity. Now, the West African Commission on Drugs was put together by Kofi Annan, just a group of distinguished gentlemen in various areas to look at the drug situation in West Africa. And this is because it was becoming a big problem, and they felt that it would be good to coordinate effort within the region to deal with the issue. And the West African Commission on Drugs was put together. So if you look at it, you see the chair there in the middle is Obasanjo, who is the former president of Nigeria. And then on the lower row to the far right, you see Adiolu, who is also a commissioner of the West African Commission on Drugs, and also the chair of the West African Drug Policy Network, who is actually driving activities within the region. Now, what were the basic objectives of this commission? First of all, it was to develop evidence-based policy within the region, and this was after taking a snapshot of all the things that they were observing within the region, doing like a quick assessment, a rapid assessment to see what the problem was, and then mobilize the public to be aware of the problems, get the government to be committed to dealing with the issues, and then they would develop capacities within the countries and also within the region to address the issue that was at hand. And so if you quickly take a look at that map, you could see that one of the things that they found out in their rapid assessment was that drugs were moving from Peru, from Colombia, and they will hit the West African coast before they were now moved to Europe. About 18 tons of cocaine, for example, was passing through the West African region every year. That's one of the things that they observed. And when it comes to the value chain for cocaine and heroin, they found out that by the time cocaine was, leaving Peru at about less than $4,000, it will hit the West African coast, it becomes $16,000. And by the time it hits Europe, it becomes $40,000. So you could see the amount of money that was moving through the region, and that made it a very, lucrative port for drug trafficking within the region. And then they also looked at some of the issues that was fueling trafficking within the region. And they found out that in all the countries in the West African region, top government officials were actually involved in the trafficking in drugs. A typical example here, we just take one of them, which is Liberia. They found out that the director of the drug authority, the drug law authority, was the one that was conniving with high-level traffickers in Nigeria to move drugs through Liberia, because it was easier to move drugs through Liberia than to move through Nigeria. So the high-level traffickers moved from Nigeria to Liberia, and they were conniving with him, and the president had to remove him. So that's just a typical example of the situation that is in the, in the West African region, that politicians and top government officials were the ones that were really pushing the issue of drugs. And so on the issue of trafficking, what they found and concluded was that West Africa was no longer a transit zone, but it was significantly a zone for consumption and production. For example, ATS is being produced in large quantity in Nigeria. In fact, within the last 3 years or so, more than 14 clandestine laboratories have been destroyed in Nigeria. And some of it is consumed in Nigeria, and the rest of it is being transported or being trafficked out of Nigeria. So that was one of the things that they found out. And the other one was that the trafficking, the consumption, the production was beginning to fracture the system within West Africa, and that was damaging also the public health within the region. And that is why one of the members of the commission stated that West Africa must not become a new front line on the failed war on drugs. In other words, we should not allow the United States and other countries to bring the war on drugs to West Africa, because it is actually a failing war, and there was no need for us to repeat that within the West African region. Now, we looked at the policies, or they looked at the policies, and to see how the West African region was responding to the issue of drugs. And all the countries have laws. But incidentally, these laws did not reflect the reality that is on the ground. A typical example is that of Gambia. The law in Gambia shows that if you frequent places where people use drugs, not that you are using drugs, but they see you frequently around there, that's an offense, and you go in for 1 year imprisonment. Now, in Ghana, for example, the laws in Ghana that they're trying to revise presently now says that if you are caught in possession of any drug, you go to prison for 10 years. But if you use that drug, you go to prison for 5 years. So in other words, that means that if they're coming to catch me with a drug, it's better I swallow it. It's better I smoke it immediately so that I can have a lesser sentence. That shows the contradictions in the laws that we find. And in Nigeria, for example, they are trying to revise a law now that is supposed to take away the discretion of the judge to determine the sentencing. In other words, the judge does not have any discretion at all. The judge is given a specific sentence that he must give to someone who is actually using drugs. And for some of the West African countries, drug offenses are now strict liability offenses. In other words, you are guilty until proven otherwise, rather than you are innocent until proven guilty. So that's the issue that we find within the region in terms of the laws. And that is why Adiolu has championed the issue of decriminalization within the zone and within the commission. And he feels that the current drug policies have neither reduced drug consumption nor put drug traffickers out of business. And therefore, it would be better to decriminalize in order to address the issues that we find within the region. And then they looked at the issue of drug demand reduction within the region. And they found out that there is possibly a near absence of harm reduction. It's only Senegal as a country that is dealing with the issue of harm reduction, but no other country in the West African region is actually doing that from that perspective. Of course, there are a few works that are being done within the West African region by CSOs and all that. For example, Youth Rights is actually working in Nigeria doing some harm reduction. However, this is not reported because it is actually illegal to do that within the country. So there is almost an absence of that. Now, the existing structures, health structures that deal with drug use problem is only found mostly in psychiatric hospitals in the government settings. And so the issue of stigma, discrimination makes it difficult for people with problematic drug use to actually access treatment in those facilities. Now, that is not to say that there are no great treatment facilities within the there are, but there are very few. For example, the capacity of treatment facility in Nigeria, for example, is not more than, that is given by government, is not more than maybe 1,000 bed spaces for 180,000 people. That is incredibly insufficient. That's one. Two, we cannot also be too sure of the kind of services that is being delivered in terms of the effectiveness of the services that is being delivered in these places. In Africa, we still find things like this. In other words, drug users are treated a lot worse than criminals will be treated because they are chained to the ground. They are chained, that they are locked up, that they have no rights whatsoever, and so on and so forth. And that's the kind of thing that we see in Africa, which is really terrible. This picture may not be very clear, but this is a place in Kaduna, and you could see that all the people here are wearing uniform like criminals. They are chained to the floor. We've done some work here. We've done so much to be able to close down this facility, but it has been impossible to close down this facility. I think Adiolu, 3 months ago, came to Kaduna and actually did a documentary on this particular place. But we've not been able to close this place down, and the government knows that they exist, and the people are treated like criminals. So the point is this: we still find things like this within the region. And that also tells us about how backward treatment facilities are and the effectiveness of those treatments. Now, is there a hope for West Africa? Well, with the kind of effort that we are seeing, most likely there is. Kofi Annan, who put this together, said that drugs have harm many more people than that drugs have harmed many people, but bad government policies have harmed many more. And that's really the truth. And, and we could all connect with that, as we see this. And that is why IDPC came together with the West African Commission on Drugs to come up with a drug policy training tool to help CSOs to be able to engage with policymakers, engage with stakeholders in order to see how they can change the narrative. And interestingly, things are happening, within our countries, even though they may be slow. A typical example is, in Nigeria, for example, there is a law that they were trying to pass, a revised law. Civil society made all efforts to contribute to that law, and it was all aborted. And it passed through the first reading, passed through the second reading in the Senate, and as they were just about to pass the law, a couple of people ran to the former president, Obasanjo, and discussed this with him. Obasanjo just wrote to the acting president, wrote to the Senate president, and that law has been put at abeyance. And that now offers us another opportunity to contribute to the law. So that tells us that with such people, there could be hope, for us within the West African region. There is this video that, the commission put together. It's just a 1-minute video, so I would just like you to watch it. Please, could you play it for us?
West Africa has a drug problem. Drugs no longer just transit through the region, they are produced and consumed here too. The market is so lucrative that a shadow economy and infrastructure has emerged. Most governments' reaction to simply criminalize drug use without thinking about prevention or access to treatment has led to overcrowded jails and blighted lives. This approach has failed wherever it has been used, and too often, the powerful and well-connected slip through the enforcement net. Rather than stopping the harmful reach of drugs, this approach has accelerated the spread of disease, fueled organized crime, and undermined democratic institutions. Drug users need help, not punishment, and West African governments must dramatically expand their drug treatment and harm reduction facilities to allow our societies to heal. The drugs problem reaches beyond borders, and so should West African governments when dealing with the problem. Civil society must be a full partner, and other regions too must do their bit. Drugs have harmed many people, but bad governmental policies have harmed many more. Now is the time to change them, together.
So the West African Commission on Drugs brought up this book, which I hope that many of us may have had a copy of. If not, we can just see it on the net. There are wonderful recommendations by the Commission, which I'm hoping that all the countries within the region are actually applying. I would like to end with this quote from Obasanjo, who was the chair. Having summed up everything, he said that we must have the courage to change policies that no longer fit reality. And that's really the truth. We must have to do that. But beyond this, my comment on this is that we must be ready to pay the price, because not everyone, even within the civil society or those within the discourse, are really interested in changing the narrative that we have presently on ground. So we must think about the price that has to be paid. We must keep forging ahead. We must remain united in working towards a common goal within the region. Thank you very much.